It began before sunrise. A thunder that wasn't from the sky, but from the mouths of German guns. In the dim light of dawn, June 22, 1941, history itself seemed to shatter. The fortress city of Brest, perched on the western frontier of the Soviet Union, was the first to feel the fury of Hitler's betrayal. At 4 a.m., the silence was ripped apart by a storm of artillery. Thousands of shells screamed overhead, tearing through barracks and burying men alive in collapsing bunkers. The Red Army soldiers stationed there had gone to sleep under a peace pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, and awoke to its ashes. Radios were dead, command lines severed. In the chaos, men clawed through concrete dust, coughing, bloodied, but alive. What they saw outside defied belief. German dive bombers swooped low, strafing anything that moved. The sky itself looked aflame. Across the Bug River, Wehrmacht troops advanced methodically, cutting off escape routes and isolating the defenders. Inside the ruined walls of Brest Fortress, Soviet soldiers, many barely out of training, fought with nothing but grit and instinct. There were no orders from above, no clear direction. Yet the fortress held. Civilians joined the defense. Women carrying ammunition, nurses dragging the wounded through the rubble, children hiding in basements as flames licked the sky. Amid the smoke and shattered stone, a message appeared scrawled on the wall of a bunker. "I'm dying, but I won't surrender." Those words became immortal, a promise written in blood and defiance. The Germans expected to capture Brest within hours. It took them over a week. Flamethrowers, explosives, starvation, nothing broke the defenders' will. Each corridor became a choke point, every room a last stand. The battle turned the fortress into a graveyard of both the living and the dead. To the Soviet people, Brest became more than a fortress. It was a symbol, proof that even in the face of betrayal and annihilation, courage could endure. As the rest of the front collapsed in chaos, the defenders of Brest fought on, their resistance echoing far beyond the walls. The war had begun in blood and disbelief, but also in an act of defiance that would define the Soviet spirit in the dark years to come. In the months before the German invasion, a strange calm hung over Moscow. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were, at least on paper, partners in peace. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939 had carved Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. A cynical deal between two dictators who distrusted everyone, including each other. For Stalin, the pact was more than diplomacy, it was strategy. It allowed the USSR to expand westward, into eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and Bessarabia, while keeping Hitler's aggression pointed at the west. To the world, Stalin appeared confident, even smug. Inside the Kremlin, however, anxiety simmered beneath the surface. From the beginning of 1941, warnings began to flow in from every direction. Soviet intelligence agents stationed in Berlin, Tokyo, and Prague sent urgent messages describing massive German troop movements toward the Soviet border. British intelligence even relayed intercepted plans of a coming invasion. Yet each report hit a wall of disbelief. Stalin brushed them aside, convinced they were part of a British plot to drag him into a war he wasn't ready for. He saw deception everywhere, except in Berlin. When German diplomats assured Moscow that troop deployments near the border were merely defensive, Stalin accepted their word. Hitler, ever the manipulator, even sent personal letters to calm him. He claimed that troop transfers were meant to protect German soldiers from British air raids, not to prepare for an attack. Stalin, obsessed with maintaining the illusion of peace, swallowed every lie. Inside the Soviet command, frustration grew. The GRU and NKVD presented maps, intercepted messages, and eyewitness accounts of German divisions forming up in Poland. Railway lines were overloaded with German tanks and supply trains. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights crossed Soviet territory daily. Still, no countermeasures were taken. Stalin forbade any actions that could provoke. Berlin. No mobilization. No reinforcement of frontier defenses, not even camouflage for airfields. This paralyzing disbelief stemmed from a deeper wound, Stalin's own purge of the military in the late 1930s. He had destroyed his officer corps, erasing initiative and courage. Those who remained were obedient but terrified. Reporting unpleasant truths could mean prison or death. And so, in those final weeks before June 22nd, silence replaced strategy. When the German artillery opened fire that morning, Stalin was asleep. Hours later, when his aides finally broke the news, he refused to believe it. Hitler wouldn't dare, he muttered. But Hitler had. And by then, the Red Army's western defenses were already burning. The Red Army that faced the Wehrmacht in June 1941 was not the army of Lenin's revolution, nor the formidable war machine that would later storm Berlin. It was an institution broken from within, hollowed out by fear, suspicion, and the ruthless will of one man. The Great Purge of the late 1930s had done more to weaken Soviet military power than any foreign enemy ever could. Stalin's obsession with absolute control, his terror of betrayal, and his paranoia toward his own generals created a catastrophe waiting to happen. Between 1937 and 1939, nearly every senior officer of the Red Army was arrested, executed, or sent to the gulags. Of the 5 marshals who had commanded under Stalin, 3 were shot. Thousands of colonels and generals disappeared overnight. Experienced division commanders, men hardened by years of service, were replaced with younger, politically loyal officers whose only qualification was obedience. By 1941, an astonishing 75% of the officer corps had been in their positions for less than a year. In many cases, entire commands were led by officers who had never seen a major operation, never planned a defense, and never challenged a superior. The consequences were devastating. Initiative became dangerous. Honest reporting could be fatal. Officers learned that survival meant telling Stalin what he wanted to hear. When intelligence came in warning of German preparations for invasion, most commanders stayed quiet or softened their reports. Nobody wanted to be accused of spreading panic. Those who tried to speak up often vanished. This climate of fear extended far beyond the barracks. The NKVD shadowed every level of the military hierarchy. Conversations were monitored, letters intercepted, and meetings infiltrated by informants. Soldiers learned to watch their words as carefully as they watched the skies. The result was a paralysis of command that would cripple the Soviet response once Operation Barbarossa began. The purge had also disrupted training and modernization. Factories producing new tanks and aircraft were left without experienced designers or engineers. Military academies were purged of instructors, leaving a generation of officers unprepared for modern warfare. When the German invasion came, many Soviet divisions were commanded by men too afraid to act without orders. And those orders came too late. In the chaos of June 1941, Stalin's own terror came back to haunt him. The army that might have stopped Hitler at the border was gone, replaced by one too frightened to move until the bombs were already falling. When the Wehrmacht struck, on June 22, 1941, the Red Army's defenses were a patchwork of half-finished plans and misplaced confidence. The Soviet border had recently shifted westward after the occupation of Poland and the Baltic states, leaving old fortifications deep inside Soviet territory, and new ones barely started. The so-called Molotov Line, a network of bunkers and defensive points meant to replace the older Stalin Line, was still under construction. Many positions had no guns, no communications, and in some cases, no troops to man them. The frontier itself was exposed, and the Red Army divisions stationed there were stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers. The deployment was dangerously flawed. Soviet High Command, guided by doctrine that emphasized offense over defense, had stationed most of its forces right on the border, in forward concentration. The logic was simple: if war came, they would strike first. But this left them disastrously vulnerable. When the Germans broke through, there were no strong fallback lines, only open fields and confusion. Defense in depth, a cornerstone of military resilience, simply didn't exist. Once the front collapsed, the retreat turned into a rout. Communication between units was another disaster waiting to happen. Soviet field radios were scarce, unreliable, and often operated by undertrained personnel. Many commanders still relied on telephones or couriers, both easily disrupted by air raids and artillery. Within hours of the invasion, entire divisions were cut off, blind and leaderless. Orders from Moscow, when they arrived at all, came too late or contradicted one another. Airfields were among the worst casualties. Concentrated in the western borderlands, they were prime targets for the Luftwaffe's opening strikes. Rows of Soviet aircraft, many still parked wingtip to wingtip, were obliterated before they ever took off. By noon on the first day, thousands of planes were burning wrecks, their crews killed in their tents. Even the Red Army's impressive numbers worked against it. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks and guns, all deployed without proper coordination. Fuel depots were placed too close to the front lines, ammunition dumps were overrun before they could be used. As the Germans advanced, Soviet units found themselves out of communication, out of supplies, and often out of hope. The Soviet frontier defenses were not just unprepared. They were fundamentally misaligned with the reality of modern mechanized warfare. The Red Army had built for attack, not survival. And when the attack came from the other side, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. By the first weeks of July 1941, the sheer scale of the German advance had turned the Western Soviet front into a nightmare. The Red Army, scattered and disoriented, faced an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was not just a tactic, it was a storm that devoured everything in its path. Panzer divisions cut deep behind Soviet lines, encircling entire armies before they could even retreat. At Bialystok and Minsk, the German 3rd and 2nd Panzer groups closed their pincers with mechanical precision, trapping hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops in massive pockets. Inside those encirclements, the situation was desperate. Communications were gone, ammunition was running low, and fuel was nearly exhausted. Soldiers fought with what little they had left: rifles, bayonets, sometimes even shovels. German tanks rolled past burning villages as columns of Soviet prisoners trudged westward. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, reducing any attempt at breakout to slaughter. By early July, over 340,000 Soviet troops had been killed, captured, or gone missing. Thousands of tanks and guns lay abandoned on the roads. The Western Front had effectively ceased to exist. Yet even as this catastrophe unfolded, the Red Army continued to fight on. Some divisions refused to surrender, retreating eastward through forests and swamps to regroup. Others vanished into the countryside, forming the first bands of partisans. The cost of delay was immense, but every hour of resistance bought precious time for the Soviet High Command to reorganize new defenses farther inland. To the south, the situation was no better. German and Romanian armies poured into Ukraine, driving toward the Dnieper River and threatening to encircle the entire southwestern front. The same errors repeated themselves. Overstretched lines, poor coordination, and Stalin's refusal to authorize withdrawals. At Kiev, nearly 760,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped in what became one of the largest encirclements in military history. Only a fraction escaped. The rest were killed or captured, their equipment lost to the enemy. The psychological blow was enormous. The Red Army, once thought invincible, had been humiliated. Entire field armies disappeared in weeks. But beneath the ruins, something unbreakable was taking shape. The grim determination to endure. These early disasters forced the Soviets to adapt, to learn from chaos, and to understand that survival itself would be their first victory. The myth of German invincibility was still intact, but for the Red Army, the fire of resistance had just begun to burn. As the German front surged deeper into Soviet territory, resistance began to take new and unexpected forms. When the Red Army's formal lines collapsed, countless isolated soldiers, political officers, and civilians found themselves trapped behind enemy positions. With no orders, no communication, and often no weapons beyond what they carried, they faced a choice: surrender or fight on their own terms. Across the forests, villages, and marshlands of Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia, they chose the latter. From this chaos, the Soviet partisan movement was born. In the beginning, these were small, desperate groups, a handful of survivors scavenging for food and ammunition, striking at German patrols, then vanishing into the trees. But their impact grew quickly. They learned to sabotage rail lines, derail supply trains, ambush convoys, and assassinate collaborators. Every bridge they destroyed slowed the German advance. Every ambush forced the Wehrmacht to divert men and equipment from the front. The partisans became ghosts in the woods, a constant reminder that even in occupied territory, the Soviet Union was not defeated. The NKVD, recognizing their potential, soon began organizing and supporting these guerrilla bands. Radio operators were parachuted behind enemy lines, caches of weapons were dropped, and local commanders were trained in sabotage and intelligence gathering. By the late summer of 1941, the partisan network had begun to form a coherent resistance, tied directly to the Central Command and operating in coordination with the Red Army. Their raids became more precise, their intelligence more valuable. Reports from behind enemy lines helped expose German troop movements and supply weaknesses, information that would later aid Soviet counteroffensives. For the Germans, the partisans were a nightmare. Their convoys could no longer move freely, and the rear zones, once considered secure, turned into battlegrounds of constant ambush and fear. Retaliations were brutal. Entire villages were burned, civilians executed, and captured partisans tortured or hanged as warnings. But instead of breaking the movement, such terror only deepened its resolve. The Soviet propaganda machine began to immortalize the partisans as heroes of the motherland. Ordinary citizens turned warriors for survival. By the end of 1941, tens of thousands were fighting in these shadow wars behind German lines. Their contribution went far beyond sabotage. They carried the spirit of resistance, proving that even without tanks or planes, the Soviet people could still strike back. The partisans became the living echo of a nation refusing to die, its heartbeat hidden deep in the forests of the occupied East. While battles raged across the front, another war was being fought in silence. A war of codes, ciphers, and intercepted whispers. In the shadowy corridors of the NKVD and GRU, Soviet intelligence officers worked around the clock, trying to make sense of the chaos that had engulfed the nation. Every radio signal, every encrypted message carried fragments of truth that could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. Among those at the forefront of this invisible struggle was Sergei Tolstoy's team of cryptanalysts, stationed in a cramped, dimly lit office where maps and cipher sheets covered every wall. They had already begun to decode Japanese diplomatic traffic, a monumental task that would have profound consequences. Through these decrypts, Soviet analysts determined that Japan, despite its alliance with Germany, would not attack the USSR in the near future. This single revelation allowed Stalin to transfer critical Siberian divisions westward, a decision that would later prove vital in the defense of Moscow. At the same time, Red Army codebreakers were intercepting communications between Germany's Axis partners. Romanian and Hungarian command transmissions revealed movements of German units and supply convoys. Piece by piece, a picture of the enemy's structure began to emerge. These breakthroughs, though often buried in bureaucratic confusion, gave Soviet commanders a glimpse of what was coming, even when they lacked the means to stop it. But Soviet intelligence work was not only about breaking codes, it was also about endurance. Cryptographers labored in basements during air raids, moving from city to city as the front drew closer. They worked with typewriters that froze in the cold and radios that crackled with interference. Their task was as thankless as it was vital to provide clarity in a war defined by chaos. The NKVD also played a key role in coordinating information between partisans and the front. Small, portable transmitters were smuggled across enemy lines, allowing guerrilla fighters to report troop movements, bridge repairs, and ammunition transports. Though communication was dangerous and often fatal, these reports provided invaluable intelligence that shaped Soviet strategy. For Stalin's command, this hidden war was the nervous system of the state. Fragile, secret, and indispensable. Without it, the Red Army would have been blind. Soviet codebreakers, often forgotten in the larger story of tanks and artillery, helped turn information into survival. In the silence between explosions, they fought their own battles. Battles of patience, intellect, and endurance. Ensuring that even when the enemy advanced, the Soviets were never completely in the dark. By the autumn of 1941, the north of the Soviet Union had become a frozen trap. The German Army Group North, supported by Finnish forces, had reached the outskirts of Leningrad. What began as an offensive soon turned into one of the longest and most harrowing sieges in human history. Encircled from land and cut off from supply routes, the city of nearly 3 million people stood alone. For Hitler, Leningrad was to be starved, not stormed. The plan was simple and cruel: to wipe it off the map without wasting German lives. Inside the city, the reality was beyond comprehension. The Red Army and the Baltic Fleet formed a desperate perimeter around Leningrad's suburbs, digging trenches and fortifying buildings while naval guns from ships anchored in the Neva River provided bombardment support. Ordinary citizens, workers, and even children joined the effort. They filled sandbags, built barricades, and carried ammunition to the front lines. Over 135,000 volunteers from the People's Militia took up arms with little more than determination and borrowed rifles. Then came the hunger. As German artillery tightened its noose, supply lines were severed and food stores began to vanish. Rations were reduced to almost nothing. A few ounces of bread per day, often mixed with sawdust or wallpaper paste. People boiled leather, ate glue, and searched the frozen streets for anything edible. Winter descended with brutal force, temperatures dropping below -30 degrees Celsius. Water pipes froze, heating failed, and disease spread unchecked. Bodies piled up in doorways and on the streets, too many to bury. Yet even in this abyss, the will to resist did not fade. Factories continued to operate under bombardment, producing shells and rifles. Schools and hospitals functioned underground. The radio kept broadcasting, not propaganda, but music. The sound of Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, composed during the siege, became a hymn of defiance. Across Lake Ladoga, a fragile lifeline was forged. Known as the Road of Life. It was a treacherous route across the frozen lake, used to ferry in limited food supplies and evacuate civilians. Trucks drove over cracking ice under constant German air raids, their headlights blacked out to avoid detection. Many never made it. For 872 days, Leningrad endured what no city should ever endure. But it never surrendered. Through starvation, bombardment, and unimaginable loss, its survival became a symbol of Soviet endurance. A city that refused to die even when death surrounded it. By the fall of 1941, the German advance toward Moscow appeared unstoppable. After the crushing victories at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev, Hitler's army group, Center, pushed forward with grim precision, its armored spearheads closing in on the Soviet capital. For Stalin, Moscow was more than a city. It was the heart of the revolution, the symbol of Soviet power. Its fall would mean the death of the state itself. As German panzers reached within 100 kilometers of the Kremlin, panic rippled through the streets. Government offices burned sensitive documents, civilians fled eastward, and the air was thick with dread. Yet amidst the fear, the Soviet command began to fight back with cold calculation. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, newly recalled from the Leningrad front, took command of Moscow's defense. He was pragmatic, unflinching, and utterly ruthless. Exactly what the situation demanded. Under his supervision, defensive lines were dug deep around the capital, barbed wire, trenches, and anti-tank obstacles stretching hundreds of kilometers. Entire neighborhoods were turned into fortresses, factories converted into makeshift arms plants, and even school children joined in digging fortifications. The capital braced itself for a siege that might decide the war. But Moscow's salvation would not come from trenches alone. Soviet intelligence had confirmed that Japan would not open a second front in the east, freeing Stalin to redeploy his battle-hardened Siberian divisions westward. These men, trained and equipped for sub-zero warfare, began to arrive in secret, their white camouflage and discipline in stark contrast to the exhausted remnants of the Western armies. Their presence tipped the balance just enough. The weather, too, turned against the Germans. The autumn rains brought the Rasputitsa, seas of mud that swallowed tanks and trucks whole. Then came the winter, earlier and harsher than anyone expected. Engines froze, weapons jammed, and men perished in the cold. Still, Hitler demanded that the offensive continue. Wehrmacht troops, ill-equipped for subarctic temperatures, dug shallow foxholes in frozen ground as the Red Army prepared its counterstroke. On December 5, 1941, the Soviets struck. Over 1 million men surged forward across the front, supported by fresh tanks and artillery. The counteroffensive pushed the Germans back 100 to 250 kilometers, liberating dozens of towns. For the first time, the Wehrmacht retreated. Moscow did not fall. Against every expectation, the Red Army had stopped Hitler's most powerful assault. The myth of Nazi invincibility shattered in the snows outside the Soviet capital, and the war on the Eastern Front would never. The winter of 1941 was not a season. It was an ordeal. The Red Army had endured 6 months of near-constant retreat, encirclement, and loss. Millions were dead, wounded, or captured. Entire cities lay in ruins, and the front stretched for thousands of kilometers across a frozen wasteland. Yet somehow, the Soviet Union still stood. The defense of Moscow marked not just a military victory, but a psychological one. For the first time since Hitler's rise, his armies had been stopped. The unthinkable had happened. The master of Blitzkrieg had been forced to retreat. It was a victory born of desperation, sacrifice, and unimaginable cost. Since June, the Soviet Union had lost over 4.5 million men, with more than half taken prisoner. Equipment, aircraft, and tanks were destroyed in numbers that defied comprehension. But, in that brutal winter counteroffensive, the Red Army found its footing. It proved that the German machine could bleed, and that the Soviet people, when pushed to the brink, could endure the impossible. For Stalin, the triumph was both a vindication and a warning. His purges and paranoia had nearly destroyed his own army, yet it was the resilience of those same soldiers, the peasants, workers, and conscripts that saved his regime. Soviet propaganda turned the battle into legend, portraying it as the moment when the motherland struck back. Across the world, the myth of German invincibility crumbled. Moscow's survival rekindled hope in Allied capitals, proving that Hitler could be stopped on land. But for those who lived it, the cost was written in snow and blood. The fields around Moscow were filled with the frozen bodies of men from both sides. Villages burned to ash. Civilians starved in the cold. The Red Army had won, but the war was far from over. Ahead lay Stalingrad, Kursk, and years of devastation before victory would finally come. And yet, from that moment in December 1941, one truth was undeniable: the tide had turned. The Soviet Union would not die. Moscow stood as a beacon in the storm, battered, bleeding, but unbroken. If you found this story powerful, share your thoughts below. What moments from this brutal campaign stand out to you most? Don't forget to like, comment, and share.